We're studying the life of Peter, and the most impactful thing that in my life, in my journey, that really set me in a new direction was studying the life of Jesus in the same way we are currently looking at the life of Christ. I think it was Patrick yesterday that stood up and said, coming from a Catholic background and talking about the Stations of the Cross for a moment, he was talking about how for many of us our understanding, especially of the Gospels, is snapshots. We know that Jesus fed 5,000, we know that Jesus fed 4,000. Which happened first and which happened second? We're not so sure. We know that Jesus walked on water. We know that Jesus crossed the Sea of Galilee with his disciples in the boat. We know that Jesus sent his disciples to cross the Sea of Galilee and Jesus was not in the boat. But which happened first? We know that an event happened in the book of Luke, and we know that an event happened in the book of Mark, but we don't fully recognize those two events were the same thing, only different perspectives of the same event. And so I wanted to take the snapshots and start to understand first, what order are those snapshots in? And then what is the connective material that moves us from one snapshot to the next snapshot? Now let me give you an illustration. I think it was about a year ago, maybe 8 months ago, Patrick came up to Chiang Mai with a group of young people, and I took them to a temple. And we pull into the temple, and we're getting out of the car, and I said to a couple of the students that were standing around me, they said to me, "Oh, you must really be an expert in Buddhism." And I said, "Well, I don't really know anything about Buddhism. I am kind of like a street Buddhist. I know more than my wife about Buddhism, and I know more than almost every Thai I know about Buddhism. But only like that much more." And I said, in actuality, the monks don't even really know anything about Buddhism. And they chuckled. So we walk up and I take them through the temple and we do different things in the temple, and we walk into the prayer room in the temple, okay? And in the prayer room, there's this mural, and it's a mural. It's that circular picture. It's called the chakra, and it's a picture of the life of Buddha and different things that happened in his life and things like that. So one of the students says to me, "What's this picture about?" And I'm like, "I don't know." I said, "I know it's the life of Buddha and stuff, but I really don't know." And he said, "Oh." And I said, "Oh, wait a minute, there's a monk over here. Let me go ask him." And I go over to the monk and I said, "Can you come help us? And these students want to understand some stuff." And he comes over and I said, "Could you explain this picture to us?" And he stands there, looks at it. "I don't know." Then he says, which was true, he said, "This is Mahayana Buddhism, and in Thailand we're Theravada Buddhists. So I don't know what it's about." And you know, the students I was talking to as we were walking up give a little chuckle in the background. But then we had a long conversation with this monk. And he was telling us how he really likes Jesus, and he really likes the stories of Jesus, and he really likes the teachings of Jesus, and he would really like to know more about it. So we have an opportunity now to share more with him about it. But my point is, if we had had those discussions in a seminar room like this, we would have never met that monk. If Jesus discipled his disciples in a seminar room like this, he would have never come across the woman from Nain whose son had just died. That was just a quote-unquote chance meeting at the crossroads of two directions. And Jesus helped that son wake up from the dead. That could not have happened if he trained his disciples in a seminar room. And when we see this journey, as Vijayan kept referring to, now we can obey 1 John 2:6, which says, if you say you love him, you must walk as he walked. And that was the driving verse for me when I did this study personally in the life of Christ. I wanted to know the footsteps of Jesus. I wanted to understand what step led to the next step. Where did it take me? I was covering his travels on a map, estimating how long it would take to get from one location to another. What was happening along that way? Now, we all know the story of the woman at the well, right? Jesus meets the woman at the well, and I'm going to quote John Ridgway on a couple of these statements right now. Jesus was with the woman at the well, and Jesus stayed with the Samaritans in their town. But we know nothing about what happened in the town except that many believed and followed Christ. Why don't we, and this is from John, why don't we know what happened in the town? And John suspects because the disciples didn't see what happened in the town. They didn't go. And then John, this is straight from John, and Jesus was using a Samaritan toothbrush when he brushed his teeth. So, you begin to picture Jesus in this Samaritan town. Perhaps, maybe some of the disciples went and John didn't go because it's John's story at that point. We don't know. But there's nothing about what happens. And I think he's there, if I remember correctly, for 3 days. And we don't know what happened. And again, it's probably because there was no witnesses to see what happened. Because that's not a place a Jewish person would go. But it is a place that Jesus went. And I'm not following in the footsteps of Jewish people. I'm following in the footsteps of Jesus. And it's a place that I want to be found. That's where I want to be found. And so I encourage you to continue, as Vijayan did, studying this journey of Peter. And even go home and get a map of the Middle East out and plot, where did these guys go? Where did Peter go? Where did this happen? What was the terrain? Was it mountainous? Was it flat? Was it wet? Was it dry? What was going on? How did they think and how did they feel? Now, as we study the life of Peter, Peter's not going to change much in Acts and following as he was in the Gospels, to be honest. He's going to mess up a whole bunch more times. But Peter lived a life that was a lot of mistakes. 90% of what we looked at Peter so far, the only time we see what we might call a success, it's immediately followed by a failure. He cuts off the ear of the guy with the sword, and then he says, I'll die with you, and then 10 minutes later, an hour, 2 hours later, he's denying Christ. Thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God, get behind me, Satan. He succeeded and failed in rapid repetition. And yet, we know from 2 Corinthians 5 that God has given to us. The purposes of God is to reconcile the world to himself. And he has given to us the ministry of reconciliation. Now, we can talk about what reconciliation is. Or we can live like Peter, succeed and fail in rapid succession, and experience what reconciliation is. And demonstrate to the world around us what reconciliation is. We are so afraid of failure. We are so afraid of conflict. We are so afraid of relational problems. We do not understand the leverage of redemption and reconciliation. We rather look right than engage in right behavior in our relationships. I want to look like I'm not divided rather than engage in reconciliation. And thus we end up living a fake life. A life that isn't real. You know, if the scriptures, and many of the scriptures are like this, but the Gospels are especially like this, if the scriptures were about perfection and success, they would have edited the story. Because the story is full of trouble and conflict and confusion and struggle and challenges of faith and doubt. Those things would be edited out. And the problem is we often edit those things out of our life. Instead of being transparent, being open with each other, encourage. If I'm helping Paul spiritually, let's say, how do I help him if the person I see is not the real person that's there? I can only help him if I'm really seeing the real person. But we need to do the same thing in the scriptures and see these real people living real lives, struggling with real things. And not just see the snapshots, not just see, Jesus and Moses and Elijah and Peter and James and John on top of the mountain. But to see when they came down from that mountain and the other disciples were struggling to cast out a demon. And then Jesus says what? What does Jesus say there? Why wouldn't the demon come out? What was the problem?
You need to fast and pray.
Yes, Jesus says this demon does not come out except by much prayer. And how much did Jesus pray when he cast that demon out? 0. What did he mean? Well, that's a question. Because he didn't pray. What did he mean when he said that? And that's a challenge that came to me as I looked at the progression of what was going on. And you can look at the same progression and find out what he meant. So I encourage you, as you go into the rest of Peter, look at the real issues. Look at the conflicts he faces. Look at what happens in Acts in his life. Peter is, I remember one guy said, I'll tell you the character of Peter. Peter did not think. He stood up and said. Peter stood up and said. And then later, he stood up and said. And then later, he stood up and said. But he never thought. No time for thinking. But we see those types of things in his life. And my definition of faith, and I believe Peter lived by faith, my definition of faith is getting into more trouble than you know how to get out of. And we saw yesterday when Peter gets out of the boat, he found himself in more trouble than he knew how to get out of. And that creates dependence. I often say I no longer practice the spiritual disciplines of prayer and Bible study and quiet time and all those types of things. I no longer practice them. I require them. I cannot live without them because I find myself being asked questions to which I do have no idea what the answer is. And a deep dependence and a deep intimacy that's been already cultivated with Christ in order to know what to say. And I'll close with one quick story on knowing what to say. It's a story I told you last night, Paul. So I was on my motorbike and I pulled up in front of a 7-Eleven. And I went into the 7-Eleven to charge up my phone with money, what do we call it? Top up my phone, thank you. top up my phone, and I was only going to be there a minute, and I was going to run in, top up my phone, come out, and go. Well, I go in, go to top up my phone. There's a friend of mine in the 7-Eleven. 20 minutes later, I'm coming out of the, as you can imagine, I'm coming out of the 7-Eleven. And there's a boot on my tire of my motorbike and a plaque on my seat, strapped to my seat, that says, "Come to the police office to get the boot removed." So I actually went to the wrong police office first and then to the right police office. We get into the police office. There's a desk. 2 police officers sitting on one side of the desk, 2 chairs on the other side. My daughter and I were together at that time, and I sat down at the desk, and Martha sat next to me. And they're arguing back and forth. You talk to him. No, you talk to him. No, your English is better. You talk to him. No, you talk to him. And Martha and I just sat there smiling. And then finally we said, "We speak Thai. You can speak Thai to us." And they said, "Well, we understand that you didn't realize you couldn't park there. So, we understand that but when it's painted on the curb, red, white, red, white, red, white, you can't park there." And I said, "Yeah, I know that." And then he says, well, there was a sign there, and it's written in Thai, so we know you don't understand, but it says you can't park there. And I said, "Yeah, I know. The sign said, Ham Chot Road." I can read Thai. And they go, "Why did you park there?" And I said, "Because I didn't think I'd get caught." Yeah, I don't lie. I said, "I didn't think I would get caught." And they look at each other and they're like, "It's going to be 400 baht for a fine." I said, "I don't have any money." And Martha says, "Dad, I got some money." And so she pulls out the 400 baht and pays him. And she gets up and she leaves, goes back outside, and the guy says, "We'll have a police officer go down and take the boot off your bike." And I said, "Why?" And they said, "Because you paid your fine." And I said, "I didn't pay my fine." And they said, "Your daughter paid the fine." I said, "She didn't park the bike." And they go, "It doesn't matter. As long as the fine's paid, you can have your bike back." I said, "You mean I can commit a crime and someone else can pay for it?" Now, where did we go from there? Now, I'm not brilliant. I didn't think that up on the fly. I didn't think that up beforehand and plan to say it. It was just what was coming out of my mouth at the time. My dependency on these disciplines, we call them, is so great that I need this intimacy with the Father. Otherwise, I'm probably going to pay a higher fine because those guys aren't laughing. But also, it was an opportunity for the gospel. And to explain, and in Buddhism, you can transfer merit. And so we actually got into a short discussion there about how one of them was saying, if my relative is sick, I can go to the temple and make merit for them. And I explained, and because the same exact thing happened, one of my wife's brother-in-law was sick, and I told him, we were going to the temple that day, and I told him, "I will go to the temple and make merit for you." But I told him, "Look, you don't know God, and God doesn't know you, but I know him, and he will listen to me because I am one of his adopted sons. And I will go to the temple and I will ask him to act on your behalf." And my relative agreed to that. The best part was my supervisor was with me at the time. And so we were going to the temple the next day, And we left the hospital, and we're going to the temple the next morning, and we're passing the hospital when we go to the temple, and I said to my wife, I knew the procedure my brother-in-law was going to have at the hospital, and it takes a long time. So I said, do you want to stop by the hospital and see how he's doing before we go to the temple? And my wife said, yeah, let's do that. So we pull into the hospital on the way to the temple, and we go in, and my supervisor's still with me. And he doesn't trust me 100%. And my supervisor's still with me, and we go in, and my brother-in-law is sitting up on the bed laughing and talking with all the people. He had a tumor in his head. That's what he was there for. And when they took him in, they were going to do stereotactic radiation, and if you don't know what that is, just look it up. It's really fun. They're going to do stereotactic radiation. It takes a lot of mathematics. So they do an MRI to map out the tumor, and I knew that takes time. So they brought him down for the MRI, and they turned on the MRI machine, and there's no tumor in his head. It was gone. And that he was healed was good news. But that my supervisor saw that happen was great news. It was exciting news. But you can go to the temple and make merit on behalf of someone else. And I can really do that because I know the Father and the Father knows me. And so we had this discussion with the police officers. And, you know, they didn't come to Christ, and nothing dramatic happened as a result of this discussion. But it was one more stone in the pavement of their journey. And those are the types of things that Peter experienced when he continually stood up and said. So enjoy your discussion this morning, and listen to one another and learn from one another. Thank you very much.